we have just finished the very last qualifying session of the ground effects turbo hybrid era, and it could not be more poised for the Grand Prix tomorrow, with Max Verstappen on pole on a 122.207 and his two closest rivals, the championship leader, in fact, Lando Norris, lining up alongside him on a 122.408. With Oscar Piastri just behind on a 122.437. I want to look at some graphs because this is one of my favourite tracks for really looking at what a driver can do to make the difference. And Max definitely made that difference. So let's have a little look at some of the traces. So this is Max versus Lando. Max is as ever in blue and Lando as ever is in papaya. And we're looking at Sector 3. Sector 3 is the most technical part of this track, and it really does show what input the driver is having on the lap time that they ultimately produce. So let's start at the beginning. So here we are coming into Sector 3. This is I'm going to call it Karun's Corner because I think it was 2021 when Karun Chandok took credit for altering part of or at least redesigning part of the track. And this used to be a horrible Mickey Mouse right, left, right. And now it's just a nice banked hairpin. And what you can see here is into that banked hairpin, they both break around the same kind of time here. But Max comes off the throttle a little bit later than Lando does. Now, why is that important? Because actually it's to do with how they overlap their braking and their throttle again. So Lando is much more interested in overlapping his brake and his throttle, whereas Max does that less so. He is essentially coming off the throttle and allowing the downforce that is generated by just coming off the throttle, taking any pace out of the car, and just allowing the aerodynamics of the car to slow him down. And he's using that to get the car to the speed he wants it before he applies the brakes. That, again, and I've said it before, that level of sensitivity is something that marks out Max. Now, on the exit is where there's a little bit of a difference. Last time out, I talked about looking for a J shape versus an R shape. An R shape is what you want. That's the throttle shape, I guess, that you want. This is what they were talking about in Qatar last week. And Lando has much more of an R shape. Max has a bit more of a J and then an S at the end. I think here he just has a little bit of a moment at the exit of the corner, has to come out of the throttle before reapplying it again. And you can actually see that Lando on the Delta improves a little bit at the exit just here. But then we get in to the hotel section. This is the really nitty-gritty technical bit of the lap. And as Martin Brundle in commentary said, the first part of it, after the two big right-hand sweepers, just hits you in the face like a brick wall, and they suddenly have to brake really hard. And again, Lando is here overlapping the brake and the throttle, whereas Max is allowing the car to do the work to get the speed down, and then just at the point at which he thinks he's not going to be able to make the corner, bang, he hits the brakes. That's an exquisite level of feel for the amount of grip available with the depleting amount of downforce available, knowing exactly when that is going to run out, when he has to hit the brakes. And that little section, look at the Delta jump. Max immediately makes up space because he's able to brake that little bit later, because he's allowing the car to slow down on the aero rather than mechanically with the brakes. But this little hotel section here, this is where Max really makes the difference. And you just have to imagine what this bit is. It's the two left-handers that take you underneath the Yas Marina Hotel, underneath that fancy little bridge. And although on camera, when you look at it on film, it looks like the cars are on rail as they go round that. They're just not. There's no way that you can get a 1 ton, 1,000 brake horsepower single-seater Formula One car around that corner on rails. No, the car is constantly sliding, and it's sliding to the tune of Max Verstappen's right foot, because this is not a set of corners that is directed through the steering. No, it is directed on the throttle, and that's what's so impressive here. Have a look at how Max applies the throttle. It's 2 peaks, 1 and 2, but see how one peak is a little bit lower than the other peak, whereas Lando is much more uniform in his application of throttle. But remember that it's that application of throttle that's rotating the car through the corner. It's not the steering. It's Max manipulating how much power he's feeding to the rear tyres, over rotating them ever so slightly to smear them around the corner and get him rotated so he can be as straight as possible for the next acceleration zone. And in that zone, in that area, look at the delta, look at the difference that Max is making just by steering on the throttle. It's beautiful. He loses a little bit on the exit here because Lando backs off a little bit before going into turn 14 and then really rockets the throttle with that nice R shape. Max doesn't have the minimum throttle, but just can't quite get the power down with that J shape that he wants at the exit, and he loses a little bit of time going through 14. 15 is flat, but it's 16 where they again have to hit the throttle, and this time Lando is the one that just has a little bit more nuance between throttle and brake, overlapping them slightly, where Max has a big fat overlap between the brake and the throttle, not using the deceleration on its own from the downforce loss. No. Now he's using the brakes and the aerodynamics to get the car slowed down, rotated, so that he can use the entirety of the space that is available to him at the exit of the corner. Remember last year where he did the same thing and just had a massive snap of oversteer? He doesn't have that here. He's got the car much more balanced, but Lando, I think, probably just does that slightly better, and they have equivalent exits. But that, I think, that this section I'm just hovering around here, this is where Max makes a difference. And Lando's actually pretty good, and I want to highlight that by just having a look at how Lando's lap in that section compares with Oscar. So this is Oscar Piastri in white and Lando again in papaya. And again, we're coming into Karun corner here. And actually, Oscar has the better entry into it. He comes off the throttle, feels where that deceleration is happening, and then is able to overlap the brake and the throttle here. Now, one thing that I do want to point out here about what Oscar is doing is that he is learning. He is at least trying to apply the methodology that he learned from Lando from Mexico onwards. He was exquisite in Qatar, and a lot of people, I think, put that down to him just having an affinity with the high grip surface that is there in Qatar. But I didn't see that. When I saw him going through turn 5 in Qatar last weekend, actually he was overlapping, he was feeling the grip, he was playing with the throttle and the brakes much more elegantly than he had been before, and that was compounding his affinity with the track and making him even faster. So I do think he is learning, but he still hasn't quite got to Lando's level. And you can see on the exit that again Oscar loses a bit, where Lando is able to have that lovely R shape. Oscar has that J shape with the S bend at the end. And again, I think he just loses a little bit. And the delta that he'd gained on entry, he loses at the exit. And he carries that through again. Again, he overlaps nicely, breaks a little bit later into that wall of turn 12. And again, he does that on entry much more cleanly, much more nuanced than Lando does. And he gets his delta right down. But from there on in, through those two left-handers, he loses time. Look at the peaks. They're just completely uniform. It's just on the throttle, off the throttle. Whereas Lando, not as much as Max, but does feel the grip a bit more. And he does that trick here where he backs off the throttle completely before turn 14 and is able to have a much cleaner application of the throttle. And Oscar just isn't able to compete. He has that S at the end of that throttle application. That throttle shape, as they called it, is much better for Lando, and it pays him back in Delta into the straight sweeper of 15. And again in 16, actually Oscar gets that back again. He really is learning how to lean on the throttle and the brake to get the rotation that he wants. And I think if he'd just been a bit more nuanced through the under the hotel section, he would have actually come out on top at the end of this lap, which is what he really crucially needed. You can hear the disappointment in his voice at the end of that lap, and I think this is what cost him. Great car, great lap, really close to his teammate, but just that last little bit of nuance, he just didn't quite have the elegance on the throttle that Lando did, and certainly not what Max did. And just to put that back into contrast, I'm going to go back to that lap that Max did. Just remember that Red Bull had taken some of the downforce off the back of Max's car. Lando and Oscar had more rear wing. They were able to apply more throttle and get the car more rotated, relying on the downforce that they had on the rear wing. Max didn't have that. And despite that, he's still able to get the car rotated how he wants, playing, dancing, as it were, with the grip available to get the car through that corner. This is mastery level stuff. This is top level stuff from a master at the top of his game. And the other two, as close as they were, just couldn't quite compete with that, I think, in the technical bit of this lap. That's how we get Verstappen on pole, Lando P2, Oscar P3. It is to do with how they extract lap time from their cars, how they feel the grip underneath them, how they dictate the angle of the car with the throttle, how they apply it with their right foot, not their steering. And in a stepwise fashion, I hope I've shown you how a true master versus someone who's very good versus someone who's learning are able to make the difference to lap time in that section of the track. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. I think it'll be great. But as usual, please like, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We'll read every single one. We'll reply to as many as we possibly can, and we'll see you guys in the next one.